The house next door. I had just moved into a charming little house in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Austin, Texas. The area was known for its friendly community and well-kept lawns. As I settled into my new home, I often took strolls around the neighborhood, admiring the neatly trimmed hedges and the occasional porch light flickering on as families settled in for the evening. My routine included visiting the local grocery store, Central Market, and chatting with the friendly cashiers about the best local barbecue joints. Life felt pleasantly ordinary until one evening when I noticed something peculiar about the house next door. The house next door had been vacant for months, and I was relieved when I saw a moving truck pull up one day. New neighbors always meant new opportunities to make friends, right? I watched as a tall, lanky man and a woman with an air of aloofness unloaded boxes, their faces obscured by the shadows of the evening. I tried to greet them, but they only offered curt nods before retreating inside, leaving me with a growing sense of unease. Their cold reception felt out of place in such a warm community. Over the following weeks, my new neighbors kept to themselves, rarely seen and never socializing. Strange noises began emanating from their house late at night. I could hear what sounded like muffled thumps and a low, rhythmic banging that lasted well into the early hours. The sounds were disconcerting enough to make it hard for me to sleep, and despite my efforts to ignore them, I found myself increasingly drawn to the mystery next door. One evening, as I was returning from a late shift at the local library, I noticed a flickering light in the basement window of the neighboring house. The glow was intermittent, casting eerie shadows against the walls. Curious, I tried to peer through the window, but saw nothing except an unsettling sense of foreboding. The light continued to flicker sporadically for days, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Days later, large, nondescript packages began arriving at the house, left on the porch and sometimes left out in the rain. The packages were always handled quickly and with an air of urgency. I couldn't help but wonder what was inside them and why they seemed to be treated with such secrecy. My curiosity grew, but I knew better than to invade their privacy. I confided in a friend about the strange occurrences, hoping to find some rational explanation. To my surprise, she seemed genuinely alarmed and advised me to be cautious. She recounted a similar experience she'd had in her own neighborhood, where the new residents had turned out to be involved in some disturbing activities. Her warning made me even more wary, but I still hoped it was just paranoia. Things took a darker turn when my cat, Whiskers, disappeared. He had always been a curious adventurer, but he never stayed away for long. I searched everywhere, including the yard next door, where I thought he might have wandered. I noticed a strange smell coming from their trash bins, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first glance. I couldn't help but think the timing of his disappearance was more than just coincidence. One afternoon, while checking my mail, I noticed the basement window of the neighboring house was slightly ajar. Driven by a mix of fear and determination, I decided to investigate. Peering inside, I saw an assortment of tools and what looked like an old, rusted cage. My heart raced as I realized these items could have sinister implications. I quickly retreated, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. Desperate for answers, I confronted the neighbors the next day. I asked them directly about the noises, the packages, and the peculiar items in the basement window. They were unfazed, denying everything with practiced ease. Their responses were too calm, too rehearsed, leaving me with a gnawing feeling that they were hiding something truly horrifying. That night, while trying to sleep, I heard a commotion next door, a loud argument followed by what sounded like frantic footsteps. I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. The sounds intensified, leading me to call the local authorities. But by the time they arrived, everything was quiet, and there was no sign of anything unusual. They dismissed my concerns as an overactive imagination, leaving me feeling helpless and afraid. Although the police found no evidence of wrongdoing, the strange events and the chilling atmosphere around the house next door persisted. The neighbors remained reclusive, and the unsettling noises eventually stopped, but my fear and suspicion never fully dissipated. The house next door remains an enigma, and I can't shake the feeling that the true horror is still lurking behind those walls, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul. The watcher next door. Moving to a new neighborhood in Portland seemed like a fresh start after my messy breakup. The house was perfect, a classic 1920s bungalow with a charming front porch and a yard that promised peaceful mornings. I spent my days unpacking and getting acquainted with the local coffee shop, the Rose Cafe, just a few blocks away. Everything felt normal until I started noticing strange things about the house next door, which had been vacant for as long as I could remember. It began subtly. One evening, while sitting on my porch with a book, I saw a shadow flicker in the window of the house next door. I brushed it off as a trick of the light. However, over the next few days, I noticed that the lights inside that house would flicker on and off unpredictably, even though no one had ever been seen coming or going. I found myself glancing over at the house more frequently, trying to catch a glimpse of someone, but always finding it empty. Things took a stranger turn when I bumped into the neighbor, Mr. Roberts, in the front yard. He introduced himself as the caretaker for the house, explaining that he was managing it for the owners who were out of town for a while. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and there was something unsettling about his hurried, awkward demeanor. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, but I assumed I was just being paranoid. The next week, I began hearing odd noises coming from the empty house. It started with faint scratching sounds in the middle of the night, like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. Then, there were louder thumps and bangs, as if furniture was being moved around. The noises were so disruptive that I had trouble sleeping, and I began to dread the quiet, unnerving nights. Driven by curiosity and mounting unease, I decided to investigate. One afternoon, while Mr. Roberts was away, I slipped into the yard of the vacant house. The front door was locked, but the windows were surprisingly easy to pry open. Inside, the house was in perfect disarray, with overturned furniture and torn curtains. It looked as if someone had hastily left it, but there was no sign of recent occupancy. As I was exploring the house, I found a note hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It was hastily scrawled in a shaky hand. "Don't trust Mr. Roberts. He knows more than he lets on." My heart raced as I read and reread the message, trying to make sense of it. The note was dated a week before I had even moved in. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that someone had been there before me, sharing my fears. That night, while trying to process the note, I noticed a figure standing outside my house, partially obscured by the trees. I could barely make out his features, but he appeared to be watching intently. My immediate instinct was to call the police, but by the time they arrived, the figure had disappeared, leaving me with no evidence and more questions than answers. Over the next few days, the tension continued to escalate. Mr. Roberts seemed to be everywhere I went, and his presence was always too close for comfort. He would casually mention things about my daily routines and show up at odd times, as if he was keeping track of me. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly aware of his watchful eyes. One evening, after a particularly unsettling encounter with Mr. Roberts, I decided to confront him directly. I asked him about the note I had found and expressed my concerns. His reaction was defensive and erratic. He stammered and eventually tried to dismiss my fears, but his evasive behavior only heightened my suspicions. I knew I had to dig deeper, but I didn't know how. Desperate for answers, I decided to research the house's history and discovered that the previous owners had vanished under mysterious circumstances. There were rumors of illegal activities and unresolved police investigations tied to the property. Everything started to fall into place, and I realized that Mr. Roberts was more than just a caretaker. He was deeply involved in whatever dark secrets the house harbored. On a particularly stormy night, as I huddled inside my home, I received an anonymous package. Inside was a photo of me taken from the edge of my yard, along with a message: "I see you. Stay out of my business." Fear surged through me as I understood the full extent of my situation. The house next door was not just abandoned, it was a nexus of danger, and I was dangerously close to uncovering something I wasn't meant to. Unable to bear the escalating threat, I decided to pack up and leave. As I drove away from Portland, I glanced back one last time. The vacant house stood ominously under the dim streetlights, and Mr. Roberts was nowhere to be seen. I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger hadn't ended, but rather, it had merely shifted. The house next door remained a chilling reminder of the dark secrets that lurked in the places we least expect. The stranger next door. It was a typical Friday night in suburban Oakville, a small town where everyone knew their neighbors. I was just wrapping up another long week at the marketing firm downtown, enjoying the familiar comforts of home. The smell of freshly baked pizza from the local pizzeria filled the air as I settled on the couch to watch the latest episode of my favorite series. My dog, Max, was sprawled comfortably beside me, and the soft glow of the living room lights cast a warm, inviting ambiance. Outside, the world seemed peaceful, with kids laughing as they rode their bikes down the quiet streets and distant car horns occasionally breaking the stillness. As the night progressed, an unusual silence began to envelop the neighborhood. The playful sounds of children had long faded, replaced by an eerie quiet that seemed to seep through the walls of my house. Max, usually the first to bark at any unfamiliar noise, lay unnervingly still, his ears perked up and his gaze fixed on the window. I tried to dismiss the discomfort gnawing at me, attributing it to the solitude of the evening and the fatigue from a hectic week. It wasn't until I noticed that the lights in the house next door were flickering sporadically that my unease turned into concern. The Johnsons, who lived there, had always been the epitome of routine. Their home was always well lit and orderly, especially on weekends when they'd usually be hosting friends or family. Tonight, however, their house was in darkness except for those erratic flashes of light that seemed out of place. I peered through the curtains trying to see if anything was amiss, but the only thing I could make out was the faint silhouette of someone moving inside. Just as I was about to dismiss the flickering lights as some sort of electrical problem, a disturbing sound pierced the night, an unsettling mix of scraping and thudding coming from the direction of the Johnsons' house. My heart raced as I strained to hear over the sudden thumping in my chest. Max growled softly, his body tense, and I found myself reaching for my phone, contemplating whether to call the police or investigate myself. After a few minutes of indecision, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly slipped out of the house, making my way toward the Johnsons' front yard. The night air was crisp, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. As I approached the house, the scraping sound grew louder, more rhythmic, almost like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I hesitated at the front door, which was slightly ajar. The flickering light inside cast distorted shadows on the walls, making the interior look even more foreboding. I called out softly, "Hello? Mr. Johnson?" But my voice seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive silence. Pushing the door open a little further, I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. The interior of the house was in disarray, with furniture overturned and papers scattered everywhere. The kitchen light was the source of the flickering, but it was only half functioning. My flashlight beam revealed what appeared to be drag marks on the floor leading from the kitchen toward the basement door. I hesitated, the thought of going down into the dark, unknown space sending chills down my spine. Summoning my courage, I descended the stairs to the basement. The steps creaked ominously with each step, and the air grew colder. The basement was dimly lit by a single bare bulb that swayed slightly, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. The scraping sound had ceased, but the thick layer of dust and cobwebs suggested that it had been some time since anyone had ventured down here. In the corner of the basement, I found a large, heavy object covered with a tarpaulin. My flashlight beam revealed part of what was underneath, a pair of blood-stained ropes and a large metal toolbox. My hands trembled as I lifted the corner of the tarpaulin, revealing a sight that made my stomach lurch, an array of unsettling tools and personal items that did not belong to the Johnsons. Suddenly, I heard the front door creak open again. Panic surged through me as I realized someone else had entered the house. I turned off my flashlight and crouched behind a stack of old boxes, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Through the dim light filtering down the stairs, I saw a shadow move cautiously toward the basement. The figure appeared at the top of the stairs, and I could barely make out the face of a man whose expression was a mix of rage and panic. He was mumbling incoherently, his eyes wild and desperate. I held my breath, praying that he wouldn't notice me. When he started descending the stairs, I knew I had to act quickly. I quietly backed away and made my way toward the basement door, trying not to make a sound. Once outside, I ran back to my house and called the police, giving them the details of the situation. They arrived quickly and took over, investigating the scene. It turned out that the man was a fugitive, someone who had been hiding out and using the Johnsons' home as a temporary hideout. The Johnsons had been out of town for weeks, unaware of the danger right next door. As I watched the police and paramedics leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that my once safe neighborhood would never feel the same again. The house next door would forever be a chilling reminder of how quickly normalcy can turn into horror.